Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning, and God bless. All right, we are continuing our sermon series on the genealogy of Jesus. We talked about Abraham, we talked about Isaac, we talked about David, and next on the list we are going to be talking about Judah. Judah is a name we are very familiar with, but he's a person we're not very familiar with. Truth be told, you're probably scratching your head for any specific instances or quotations by the patriarch Judah, the one from whom the great tribe of Judah comes, that we are given King David, King Solomon, and through that beautiful line, eventually and always, King of Kings, Jesus Christ. And here we are in Genesis. If you want to turn to Genesis chapter 38, that's where we're going to zoom in. Here we are in Genesis chapter 38, and we're in a story within a story. That's called an inset. All right? It's where you have a story, and in the midst of it, sandwiched around it, is another story that doesn't seem to have anything to do with it. It's its own thing. But when we look closer at it, we understand that it helps us to be able to understand what happened before and what's happening after. That's what an inset is. Famously, all right, the bleeding woman, all right, when Jesus was on the way to heal Jairus' daughter, the bleeding woman is a perfect example of an inset, of a funny thing happened on the way to the forum, wherein which Jesus was able to heal this woman on the way to heal another girl, and consequently the healing of the woman helped the man to see the power of Christ. So here we are, and the inset that we are in is in the midst of the greater story of Joseph. We had a sermon series on that not too long ago about Joseph, so I hope you all remember. Joseph was the 11th son of Jacob, all right, and he was the favorite son, and he let everybody know about it, which wasn't terribly appropriate. But with his beautiful coat of many colors, that made him a target because of his love from his father, and because of the powerful gift of his dreams, that made him a target because of the love from the Father above. And consequently, the other 10 brothers did not look favorably upon Joseph, and Joseph found himself looking unfavorably on the inside of a well. Well, that could have been the end of Joseph's story, but it is not. But we are left there. We are left with him in the well, in the midst of the well, him being pulled out instead of killed, him being sold first to, let's see here, the Ishmaelites, and the Ishmaelites sold him to the Midianite traders. The Midianite traders got him to the Egyptians, and then eventually he finds his way to Potiphar's house, but we're not quite there yet. We're not following that story. Right now he's sold into slavery, and now we're going to pause hanging on the life of Joseph for a chapter that has nothing to do with Joseph and has everything to do with Judah. And there's a deliberate tension here. As we've been following along of the story of Joseph and God's calling for Joseph, and now the terrible circumstances, the trial that he's been laid in, and we take a break. We take a terrible cliffhanger where we're left wondering about the fate of Joseph, where now we deal with one of the perpetrators, and we zoom in on the life of Judah. And as we get to it, I'm going to let you guys know in advance, chapter 38, hang on to your hats, because it's going to get wild. All right, it's about as wild as it gets. It might even be uncomfortable, but it's the Word of God, so we're going to study it. And there's something powerful in here for us to understand. This is where we're truly going to zoom in on the personhood of Judah and understand who this actual historical person was in his life and what he did. And keep in mind where we're coming from, what he just did. And here we are now pulled into his life story. Beginning in Genesis 38, verses 1 through 5 is the introduction. It happened at that time that Judah went down from his brothers and turned aside to a certain Adulamite whose name was Hira. There, Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua. He took her and went into her, and she conceived and bore a son, and he called his name She conceived again and bore a son, and she called his name Onan. Yet again she bore a son, and she called his name Shelah. Judah was in Keseb when she bore him. Well, I'm glad to see things are working out well for Judah, right? After all, his brother is now in the midst of slavery. He has a destiny of prison awaiting him and terrible times for 22 years. And Judah, he gets to go and live his life. It says he departed from his brothers as if he's just now leaving from selling his brothers with all that silver coin in his hands. And he goes to visit a buddy of his, an Adulamite named Hira. And while he's there, he spies a girl, a woman of the Canaanites of all people. Did you notice that? And took her as a wife. If you know anything about the cultural interweavings of the politics of the Old Testament, it would be very shocking to discover that the wife of Judah is a Canaanite woman. After all the things and all the troubles that we went through in the previous generations, where Abraham, of course, he married, his near relative Sarah, so that the line would be pure. And then he goes and he gets his son Isaac, and he's looking around at all these Canaanite women around him. He doesn't want anything to do with them. So he sends his servant to go all the way back into the place of his forefathers, his family, to pull someone from them so that Isaac wouldn't have to marry a Canaanite woman. And that's how we get Rebekah. And then we have Jacob and Esau. Esau, he marries a couple of women in the region and doesn't work out too great. And so, of course, they're concerned again. And once again, Jacob, he goes off. He's also kind of running away from a little family drama at the time. He goes back again to the family to pull another woman. And here we finally come to Judah, as we've been carefully cultivating this family line. And then we get to Judah, Judah from whom the tribe is coming from, right? Judah, where it's going to focus in. And we know the story, so we know what's coming in. And Judah marries a Canaanite woman. And he's living his life. He has 3 sons. My 3 sons right there. Onan, and Shelah. And interestingly enough, if you notice anything, she names all the sons, too, and gives them their names. And he's ready to go on living his life. And it's not fair. It's not fair. Why should he prosper after the wicked things he's done? Why should Joseph suffer through the wicked things that Judah and his brothers have done? It's not fair at all. But life's not terribly fair, is it? Especially not at the beginning of the story. It won't make for much of a story if we have everything hunky-dory at the onset of it, when we have to move forward through the drama to see God's powerful actions and interventions therein. So let's jump now to verses 6 and 7. And Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. Now, we don't know what crime or crimes, plural, were. We just know that the definitive judgment upon him was that he was wicked. The Word of God omnisciently determines for us explicitly the judgment upon and is removed from the story. This is the start of the line of Judah. This is the auspicious beginning of this tribe, the firstborn of the tribe, killed by God for wickedness. But in the midst, like you miss it, we're introduced to actually our protagonist of this chapter, and it's not Judah. It's Tamar. Tamar, whom we don't know much about. Tamar, whom we don't know practically anything about. We don't know anything about her lineage, or her family, or her kin. She just appears in the story. We just know that she was chosen to be the wife of the firstborn of Judah, and that Judah picked her. That's all we know about her as we're introduced to her. That and that she is now a young widow because her husband died. Verses 8 through 10 continues, Then Judah said to Onan, Go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her, and raise up offspring for your brother. But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his. So whenever he went into his brother's wife, he would waste the semen on the ground so as not to give offspring to his brother. And what he did was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also. Now, what we're talking about here is Levirate Law. And what's very fascinating about it is it's given to us before the law is given. And it seems to be an understood thing, for after all, Judah talks to Onan and he says, Go do your duty, as if he should have known what his duty was. Before the giving of the law, an understanding of at least this custom was already within the house of Abraham. That they should take care of it. And if you don't understand the purposes of this, is that a woman, if she dies, and she is a widow, and she has no offspring from her husband, she is bereft in this culture. She has no one to care for her, no one to affix her to the family anymore. That was her link. And in order to ensure that she would be able to have a part of the family, ensure that she would be able to have a place in the society, it was the duty of the next brother in line to be able to provide for her a child, so that she would have a child. She would have a tangible, blood, living relative link to the family, and therefore would not be lost in the society. But that child would be the firstborn's child in the eyes and the hearts and the law of everyone. And the problem, therefore, that Onan has is, if I provide an heir for my dead brother then I will not get the fullness of the inheritance. And so Onan decides that he will not provide an heir for his brother But he also decides that he will still take full advantage of Tamar, and uses her for his own purposes without providing the duty. He does the right thing for the absolutely wrong reasons. And the result is not the life that God intended, with a new child and a new purpose and a life for this woman, but instead death for that man. Because he committed a grievous sin of taking advantage of his sister-in-law sexually. You know, we are not called just to do the right thing. We're called to do the right thing for the right reasons and in the right way. That is what perfection looks like. The means do not justify the ends, or the other way around. Instead, we are to do the right thing for the right reasons in the right way. In 1908, the New York Times reported a story about a dog that was in Paris. Okay, and I don't know what New York Times tells about it, but it was in Paris, and it was a famous dog because it was rescuing children from the river, pulling them out of the river to safety all over the place. And because it was constantly doing this, it became a very famous dog, and then it was beloved by the parents and given treats and everything. But we come to find out that the dog was first pushing the kids into the river so that he could pull them out because he knew he'd get treats for them. Now, I know I've heard the phrase, all dogs go to heaven, but I think there's an exception right here. Doing the right thing for the wrong reasons. Onan is just as wicked as his brother, just as dead as his brother. And interestingly enough, just as removed from the situation by God as his brother. Remember, think of this in a Christological sense. Think of this in the genealogy to come. And the wickedness of is removed, and the wickedness of Onan also removed from the line. But you know who's not removed? Tamar. Tamar is the consistent part in here. See, God has already chosen his many times great-grandmother in Tamar. Right now, he's just auditioning great-grandfathers. And he hasn't found any that are great quite yet. And the wickedness of and the wickedness of Onan have removed them from the equation. And that brings us now to verse 11. Then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, remain a widow in your father's house till Shelah my son grows up. For he feared that he would die like his brothers. So Tamar went and remained in her father's house. Judah's doing the math on this. And he said, I gave her one son and he's dead. And I gave her another son and he's dead. I got one son left. We're going to hold off on this. He says of Shelah, Shelah's too young. He's not yet ready to do his duty. So why don't you put on your widow's clothes and all that stuff. Why don't you go actually even leave and go back to your father's house as if you were never married. You wait over there where you're out of sight, out of mind, out of the family, out of our culture, out of us, and take that curse with you. And we're just going to live our life. And don't worry. When Shelah comes of age, don't call us. We'll call you. That is 100% Judah's perspective on this, and it's 100% wrong. Because he sees Tamar as the curse. He doesn't see the plank in the own eye of his family as the problem. He thinks that she's the problem because she's the consistent part. But the other consistent part are his wicked sons. And if Shelah, whom we know nothing about him or his character yet, it has been revealed to us, if Shelah is a righteous man, if Shelah would do his duty, in the eyes of God, all would be good. But Judah prevents this. Judah interjects his own will because of his own fears. And instead pushes away Tamar and does the very thing that the Levirate Law was designed to prevent. He casts her out of the family. She is no longer connected to them. And she lives now in another house, in another town for all we know, completely separated away. And not a part at all of the tribe of Judah. Bereft in a society that does not look kindly on motherless widows. Verses 12 through 14. In the course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. When Judah was comforted, he went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers, he and his friend Hira the Adulamite. And when Tamar was told, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep, she took off her widow's garments and covered herself with a veil, wrapped herself up, and sat at the entrance of Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah was grown up, and she had not been given to him in marriage. It's called a redeemer. If you're at all familiar with the book of Ruth, which is it's completely written around the concept of Levirate Law, of the family redeemer, of the one who claims those who are dead to society so they would not be overlooked and forgotten. Fortunately then, in that story, we will have a righteous man in Boaz. But there is no Boaz in this story. Living and growing and seeing Shelah growing up, seeing that he has come of age, and seeing that she is still alone and isolated and left to the side, she understands entirely that Judah will not keep his promise. That Judah will not keep his oath. That Judah will not do his duty to God and to her, and ironically enough, to her. So, she puts on a disguise. She sets herself up with an alter ego, and she puts herself on the path that she knows that he will go. Apparently, he's walking off the slope. There were heralds that came to let him know. But she was able to interject to be in the right place at the right time. And before we go on, I'm just going to go ahead and give you spoilers. Shelah is not going to have anything to do with the rest of this story. And that should be very interesting to us from Shelah's perspective. Because by right, by birth, Shelah should have been the father of kings. But he won't be. Because of Judah's good-intentioned meddling, Shelah is not in the Christological genealogy of our God. He's just a name of note. It has nothing to do with anything. But it could have been greater. And when we shirk our duty, when we deny our obligations, we deny the privilege with it as well, and the glory and the honor of it as well. If we look at things that we are called to do in the service of our God as obligations only, as duty only, and we don't see the honor in it, if we look at it as things that we have to do, we will fail to see it as things that we get to do, and then we won't get to be whom we're called to be. Do we glorify people with great titles who do nothing? No. Do we glorify people who do nothing and don't have great titles? No. It's the doers. Those who overcome, those who do the unexpected, those who do the unusual, those who do good are the ones that we remember and are glorified in the text for eternity. And we shout praises whenever we hear their names and wish that I could be just like that guy. We don't remember Shelah. And we don't. Well, I don't think we're even intended to. He's merely a footnote. He fades away in history. Now Judah, instead, he goes forth. He's doing his best life. He's getting to go with the sharing the sheep, which means that he's been prosperous. Once again, everything's coming up Judah. It's not fair. But God doesn't forget. And God is not blind to those that we ignore in society. God is in this plan. Verses 15 through 16. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. He turned to her at the roadside and said, "Come, let me come in to you." For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. She said, "What will you give me that you may come in to me?" You know, yes, she has a disguise. Her face is covered. But she's talking to him. And that's the thing that always gets me. Whenever you talk about a superhero and a secret identity, right? And they're going around, it's the same voice. And they go around people that they know well, they talk to all the time. It's the same voice. It's even worse with Superman. Clark Kent's got those glasses on. Without the glasses, he's an entirely different person. All right? And I'm sorry, with whatever convoluted excuses that we have, and I love comic books, but Christopher Reeve still has that amazing bone structure, whether he's wearing glasses or not. You know who it is. The interesting thing is, he doesn't recognize her at all, simply because of the veil. She doesn't disguise her voice. She merely puts on a veil, and that's enough for him to not recognize her. She who should be his daughter-in-law, she who should be his daughter, she who should be under the shadow of his wing of protection, he doesn't recognize her at all. Largely because he doesn't want to. Mr. I said this is an insect. And you know what? This is in the middle of the story of Joseph. Famously, when the brothers later on will come and they'll go over to the presence of Joseph, Joseph, who has inexplicably risen from the ranks of slave to prisoner to now second only to the king in all of Egypt, in his intense regalia and all the glory, and they go right before their own brother, and they don't recognize him at all. And now I know he's got like the hat, and he's got the thing, and they all these Egyptians have to hit the gym because they don't wear shirts. And so he's got all this wonderful regalia going on, and they don't expect to find him there, but he's their brother. He's their brother. Shouldn't they at least see their father in him? See some of their mothers in him? Shouldn't they see him? Shouldn't they recognize his voice? I don't know about you, I've never done it, but if I threw someone into a well and then sold them into slavery, I'd have a hard time forgetting their face, let alone if he was my kin. That type of betrayal you should be carrying with you always. But they don't recognize him. You know why they don't recognize him? You know why Judah doesn't recognize Tamar? They don't want to. Did you know that your nose is always in your field of vision? It's always there. Just your brain chooses to ignore it. And I know all of you are looking cross-eyed right now. You know why? Because we don't want to see it. And your mind has an incredible power to see what it wants to see, to not see what it doesn't want to see. We're talking about the family of Jesus. When Jesus came, in all of his righteousness and wisdom, goodness and selflessness, and those who had dedicated their lives to the service of the temple of this God stood in his presence. You couldn't see past their nose to see he was right there. They couldn't recognize him for who he was. They didn't recognize the sound of his voice. And I got to tell you, church, we need to be prepared to recognize the sound of our God's voice, because it is our God's voice which calls us to rise. It is our God's voice which enables us to follow him when the good shepherd comes from his sheep. The thing that separates the sheep from the goats is the sheep know the voice of the shepherd. We have to stop ignoring what's right in front of our face. See truth. Which means we've got to spend time with him. We can't push him away, excise him from our family and our life and our living, so that when he comes right before us, we don't recognize him anymore. Judah stands before his daughter-in-law. First thing that he assumes, she's prostitute. And you know what? That says a whole lot more about Judah than it does say anything about Tamar or anything else. It's called false consensus effect. And that is, we assume everyone is like us and thinks like us and responds to stimuli and facts and data and other things like us. And so therefore we will assume that they will behave like us in those ways. Therefore, someone's expectations, someone's predictions about something tells you far more about the predictor than what they're predicting about. And someone's accusations, by the way, also tell you far more about the accuser than whom they're accusing. So we should be a lot more careful if we didn't have any other reasons not to gossip. We should be very careful about what we assume about others, because we tattling on ourselves. Judah assumes that she's exactly what he is apparently looking for. No hesitation. His wife has passed, yes, and the time is over, but immediately sees a woman by the side of the road. He wants to take advantage of it. He wants to offer her something in exchange for it. And we see that Judah is in no ways different from those wicked sons. Judah is exactly like Onan, in the sense that he wants to take advantage of another person and use them as an object for the fulfillment of his lust, just as Onan. And this is the father of the tribe of Judah. This is the auspicious beginning of the tribe of kings. That if we look through their history, always had a bit of a problem when it came to their relationship with the ladies. If we're uncomfortable talking about this good, we'll talk about lying and stealing. We'll talk about murder all day long. When we start talking about lust, people get quiet and awkward. We need to stare at face in the eye, because there is a problem with lust in this world. There is a problem with lust destroying families, destroying young women, destroying young men. And we need to face the sin head on, to know it for what it is and call it out for what it is, so that we don't fall into the trap of being like Onan and the troubled house of Judah. Verses 17 through 19. He answered, I will send you a young goat from the flock. And she said, if you give me a pledge until you send it. He said, what pledge shall I give you? She replied, your signet and your cord and your staff that is in your hand. So he gave them to her and went in to her, and she conceived by him. Then she arose and went away, taking off her veil. She put on the garments of her widowhood. So what will you give me? A young goat from the flock. There's a running theme in the Old Testament. I don't know if you're aware of this. Hebrew ladies, Canaanite ladies, they do not want chocolates and flowers. Leave your roses and bonbons aside. All they want is a kid. And I'm not talking about a kid, I'm talking about a young goat. That is how you woo the ladies in this region. All they want is that birria, all right? They want that slow-cooked goat, and you provide it for them, and then it swoons hearts. Samson was bringing a young goat to smooth things over with his wife after he was kind of a jerk at the wedding. We see it happen all the time. And so the first thing that pops in Judah's mind, the way that he will be able to pay for his services is with a young goat he offers to her. But he doesn't have one on him, because he came for the shearing of the sheep. So he says, I'll give you a promise. And lo and behold, Tamar is not willing to take him on his word. Surprisingly, she doesn't say, okay, I'll trust you. No, she requires a little collateral. And what is the collateral she asks of him? Very specifically, your signet, the cord that the signet is hanging upon, and your staff. These are explicitly mentioned things that she chose, and I want you to know exactly why she chose them. If you know anything about a signet, today we mostly talk about that as our initials, what we use. The signet was the seal of a person, how you knew it was explicitly from them. Right? It was their mark. And apparently their signets were not on rings that was used to have in medieval times. Instead, it was substantial and it hung upon a cord around his neck. That is what she requests in addition to his staff. And I need you to understand that according to Ellicott, he says that the signet was a lion. Hence where we get the phrase, the Lion of the tribe of Judah. He's drawing this because through tradition, they look at the prophecy that Jacob lays upon all the sons in Genesis 49 as ones dealing with their signets, their individual signs of their clans. And in it we see interesting things like that Benjamin is the wolf, okay, that Zebulon is the ships, Issachar, a donkey, I don't know what that says about him, and then Dan is a viper. That doesn't bode too well. But when we get to Judah, Judah, of course, is the lion, from which we get the Lion of the tribe of Judah. If we go to Genesis 49, and we look at verses 9 through 11, it says this, the prophecy that Jacob lays over his son Judah. Judah is a lion's cub. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He stooped down, he crouched as a lion, and as a lioness who dares rouse him. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him. And to him shall be the obedience of the peoples, binding his foal to the vine, and his donkey's colt to the choice vine. He was washed his garments in wine, and his vestiture in the blood of grapes. And if you don't hear Jesus in all of that, then you ain't trying. All right? In fact, you're actually trying not to hear Jesus, because this is absolutely packed to the gills with the presence of the Prince of Peace pouring power upon us if we simply see it. All right, with the wine, the vine, the foal of the donkey, all of these things are prophecies that Jesus Christ fulfilled in the final week. All of these things are pointing to Christ, and they're also pointing explicitly to Judah being the king of the tribes. And what is the symbol of that authority? His scepter. And what is it that Tamar asks of her father-in-law? I want your signet, and I want your scepter. I want the things that have been denied me. I want authority For I am powerless in this society. And I want identity. Because you have kicked me out of this family. You have cast me aside and forgotten me and said good riddance, and I have no identity now without it. And we're going to get to the point later on where many times it is erroneously referred to as Tamar playing the harlot. I'm going to let you know another interesting secret. If you look in the words, she never once refers to herself as such. She never once identifies herself at all. In fact, the only thing that she does is veil her face. She strips herself of her identity as a sign act of what Judah has done, by stripping her of the rights and privileges of being within the tribe of Judah. And so the payment that she asks is identity and authority to preserve her. Not once, if you'll notice, does Judah ask her if she is or whom she is. He never even asks for her name. Because he doesn't care. And he doesn't want to know. Oh, he'll use her. But he won't know her. So she asks for identity and authority. She asks to not be lost in this world and another sad story. She has to be restored and to hold the vestiges of the tribe of Judah as her own. And amazingly enough, he gives them to her. And unsurprisingly, God blesses her womb and she conceives. And then she leaves, removing her veil and returning her vestiges of widowhood, because she has been restored to her proper place in whom she should be. The story now continues, verses 20 through 23. When Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adullamite to take back the pledge from the woman's hand, he did not find her. And he asked the men of the place, "Where's the cult prostitute who was at a name at the roadside?" And they said, "No cult prostitute has been here." So he returned to Judah and said, "I have not found her." Also, the men of the place said, "No cult prostitute has been here." And Judah replied, "Let her keep the things for her own, or we shall be laughed at. You see, I sent this young goat, and you did not find her." And here's the interesting thing. Judah keeps his word, probably because he wants his stuff back. But Judah keeps his word to a prostitute, but breaks his oath to his daughter-in-law. Judah goes to get back his things, and they can't find her. And they discover that there was no one at all. And now it's a great mystery. And now, for shame of being discovered, shame of being embarrassed, let's hightail it out of here and just let it go. Let my signet just float out there. You know, I've seen a couple movies to the regard. If someone steals the plates that you print the United States currency on, we're not just going to go, "Oh, well." We're going to want to track that down, because that's establishing something with our seal, with our authority that is not from us, right? But he's willing to let it go out of shame and fear of embarrassment alone. But the most important thing about this paragraph that we really need to zoom in on is he doesn't just refer to her a prostitute as he did before. He explicitly refers to her as a cult prostitute. You know what that means? See, in the Canaanite region, they did all sorts of abominations. The reason why you were supposed to refrain from association to them is because they were wicked down to the core of their society. What they thought was good was abject evil. It wasn't them doing wrong things. It was them not knowing the difference between right and wrong, thinking wrong was right and right was wrong, and infecting people with the wrong mindset so that they'd be so turned around and so lost that you couldn't even value truth, even if you wanted to find it. And if that doesn't sound familiar, you ain't looking around. And so in this culture, the culture of the Canaanites, one of the ways in which they worshiped their dark gods was through officially sanctioned, hired, on-commission staff prostitutes. So Judah wasn't just committing sin. Judah was engaging deliberately in what he believed to be the false worship of false gods. This is apostasy. This is as bad as it gets. This is him running among full force into the world. And when he came down to payment, he remembered. He wants to get his stuff back, but he doesn't even go himself. He sends his buddy, the Adullamite, to render payment. And you know what? It wasn't just maybe it was a thought. They said it once is an instance. They said it twice could be a coincidence. 3 times in this paragraph, the term cult prostitute is used. In the hardness of their hearts, Judah was committing apostasy, deliberately going outside the auspices, the goodness, the care, the righteousness of his God, whom he was disobeying in the treatment of his daughter-in-law, to go to whom he thought was an entirely different person, but was the same. And it magnifies the sin and the willfulness, and what he thought it was makes it even worse. And this is the auspicious beginning of the tribe of Judah. Genesis 38:24. About 3 months later, Judah was told, Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has been immoral. Moreover, she is pregnant by immorality. And Judah said, bring her out and let her be burned. And wow, the audacity. Wow. See, he's assuming that she is engaged in sexual immorality. He is assuming that she has prostituted herself out there. And so he is going to, in his self-righteousness, purge her of her evil right after he failed to pay off the prostitute that he sought with his own heart. Right after he engaged in apostasy and worship of Canaanite gods, and he doesn't even know which one because he didn't bother to ask. He just assumed and was okay with it. Because Tamar never once said, Tamar never once led him to believe. Tamar never once said, this is who I'm working for, this is what I am. Tamar never. All Tamar did was strip herself of identity, and he projected upon her everything that he assumed. And now, when he discovers that his daughter-in-law, whom he refused to give his son so that she could have a child, has a child outside of his will, and outside of his authority, and outside of what he thinks is okay, oh no, you can't do that. Because I won't let you. I won't let you live your life. I won't let you move on. I won't let you have what you're supposed to have either. So what are you supposed to have? He hasn't cared one whit about her since the death of his second son. But all of a sudden, he hears that she's pregnant because he hasn't been living his life with her. He hears that she is pregnant. And then only now does he care. He seeks her out to destroy her. And he is no different than all those men who dropped their stones when Jesus said that he without sin cast the first stone. And he is right now blustering full of hypocrisy and injustice and irony, worst of all. Because he's completely oblivious. He's not self-aware enough to understand who he is, let alone to understand who Tamar is yet. Verses 25 through 26. As she was being brought out, she sent word to her father-in-law, by the man to whom these belong, I am pregnant. And she said, please identify whose these are, the signet, and the cord, and the staff. The Judah identified them and said, she is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah, and he did not know her again. The courage, the chutzpah, for Tamar to calmly say, as she was being brought out to be burned at the stake, I am pregnant by the man whom these belong to. Do you know? Can you identify these? And now we understand why she asked the price that she did, the collateral that she did. Because it is unmistakably his. No one else has that signet. No one else has that staff. These mark him undeniably. The tests show you are the father. And in the face of that undeniable evidence and proof, all of a sudden he understands something very powerful. Same way when Nathan brought forward a parable to David after he had killed Uriah and abused Bathsheba, he heard undeniable truth and learned something about himself. You see? This is an inset, remember? We're between chapters 37 and 39. In chapters 37 and 39, Joseph is identified by unique items that can only be his. After they pull him out of the well and they sell him into slavery, they rip up his coat of many colors, and they cover it in blood, and they show it to their father, and say that he is clearly dead. He must have been ripped apart by some wild animal. And based upon the items of his office, he is identified. And then we jump over this chapter to chapter 39, when Potiphar's wife gets a little handsy, and he runs and flees, and she grabs a hold of his coat that he shakes free to get out of a terrible situation from an unrighteous woman, and then she lies about it to her husband, saying, "See, I have his coat." And once again, his garment, his vestiture, identifies Joseph falsely. And in the middle of that, to help us understand that, Judah is rightly identified for what he has and what he has done. In the midst of all of this, he sees his own armor stripped as he sees his own items brought before him. And he declares that she has been more righteous than I. And this is the turning point for Judah. This is the transformation for Judah. Because she was burned twice, wasn't she? She was given nothing but wicked husbands from Judah, all right, and then denied the third. She should be, forget these people. I'm quit of them. I'm well quit of them. They haven't done me any good. And she should have just gone off and tried to do something else, but she continued to pursue her relationship. She continued to pursue her identity in the tribe of Judah, when the tribe of Judah had done her no good, and she has done nothing but good for them. Because all along, as I said, God had chosen her to be his many times great-grandmother. He had chosen this righteous woman who would ensure the pact of the privilege of the lineage would continue, because she was literally the vessel for God's salvation for the tribe of Judah. She would literally bear the deliverance that this messed up, broken family needed to get back on the right track. And it's only when she comes that he is transformed from no longer seeing a blind eye to all of his own sin and his own unrighteousness and his hypocrisy and his covetousness and his greed and his evil that he'd been permitting all of his life, because we haven't seen anything good from Judah up until this point. And now he's transformed to someone who can repent. And having repented, this is the first time we ever hear a declaration from Judah that he cares about righteousness. He exonerates her by saying that she was more righteous than I. And that changes his perspectives on everything. This is going to transform the lives of not just this man, but the hope we have through this man's family. See, up until this point, Judah was afraid to do the right thing. See, Judah had given a son and lost him, and given another son and lost him. And he had one son left. All his hopes were dependent upon this one last son. But he was too afraid to risk it. He was too afraid to risk losing his only son. And unlike his grandfather Abraham, was unwilling for the sake of righteousness to risk the life of his only son, his only hope for the future. He clung to the things of this world, things that he could see. And he did not hope in the God who had called him. He wasn't listening to him. He was too busy ignoring the nose in front of his face. But see what God does. See what God does with this evil. We know famously that Joseph would say, what you intended for evil, God turned to good. Look what he does with the evil that Judah is doing in this chapter alone, and see how he transforms it. The chapter concludes for us with verse 27. When the time for her labor came, there were twins in her womb. And when she was in labor, one put out a hand, and the midwife took and tied a scarlet thread on his hand, saying, "This one came out first." But as he drew back his hand, behold, his brother came out. And she said, "What a breach you have made for yourself." Therefore his name was called Perez. And afterward his brother came out with the scarlet thread on his hand, and his name was called Zerah. You see, God pruned the family tree. He took out two wicked sons. And Judah saw it as a curse. And for fear, he chose to lose a daughter as well. But God's plan was to restore his family. Yes, 2 sons were taken. But by an unexpected blessing, you've been given 2 more sons. Perez and Zerah, and in them, the hopes of the future. In them, a story very similar to the birth of Jacob and Esau. Only things work out a little bit differently, don't they? All right, the first one, he comes out instead of grabbing the heel of his brother. He gets the arm, he gets the thread, and the brother says, "Excuse me, I will be born first." And from Perez, we get down the line of kings. From Perez, we get the hope that we need. From Perez, we get Jesus. The hope that we know. See, with his earthly eyes, with his thick-skinned schema, with the shackle of his mind, and not being able to see anything out of this, he saw he lost 2 sons. He assumed he would lose a third, and he assumed his line would be over. But if he'd only trusted in the Lord instead of what he saw, if only he trusted in God to keep his promise, he would have had the courage to stand on righteousness and the promise of God and keep his own. And even though he refused to, even though he went into apostasy and hypocrisy, God still pulled him kicking and screaming from the shadows of darkness into the hope of the promise that he laid to his grandfather. The hope of the promise that he laid to all of us in the garden. That the seed of the woman would crush the serpent, and we would be free. And he continues here. Of all people, at knucklehead you. This right here is the greatest evidence you need to know that the scriptures are true. Because it's not propaganda. Because if you're going to tell me that God would be born of a family, born of a human family, you better believe that that family would be absolutely just angels and saints, just singing around all day long and everything be crisp and beautiful and glorious. But no, we are seeing every single one of the skeletons in the closet, and we know them by name. This is not propaganda, this is truth. Because more than having perfect people to bring God into this world, which would 100% be the story that man would concoct and it would be flawed, God chooses to demonstrate his glory through imperfect people, with imperfect means, with selfish, dark hearts, because God is not trying to show that perfect people can bring God into this world. No, God comes into this world because of sinners and flawed people that need redemption, and we can't get it from anywhere else. So Jesus comes to answer the call that we are afraid to send out to him. Jesus comes to answer the prayer that we are too ignorant in our evil to ask for. Jesus comes and shows us the truth. And he frees us from our past selves. And he proves it with his own family. He proves it with his own family. Judah is restored and he gets more than what he had before. 2 sons for 2 sons. And interestingly enough, tradition, as I said, the scriptures don't tell us anything about Tamar, but tradition has held that Tamar was actually one of the kin, one of the family. And if that's the case, then we have removed the segment of Canaan that was going to move the line bringing forward. And instead, we have none of the daughter of Shua in the line of Jesus Christ. But Tamar instead is chosen. Now sure, Jesus absolutely brings in a survivor from Jericho and Rahab. And he absolutely brings in a Moabitess and Ruth. And both of them were exceptional women of their cultures. Both of them were exceptionally righteous in pursuing God explicitly. And that's why they grafted onto the vine as we eventually are grafted onto the vine. But I can't help but notice that he explicitly excludes this Canaanite woman from the tribe. From her and from Onan and their wickedness is cut off. Shelah, we don't know anything about him. He doesn't even get to know his play. Instead, she goes straight to Judah himself, circumventing all of that, and goes and restarts the line, gives him a new start with a new family and 2 new sons. And that doesn't just transform the hopes of Judah, it transforms his perspective on life. As I said at the beginning, this is an inset. This story is about the redemption of Judah and helps us to see it. Because if we go in the previous chapter, chapter 37, verses 26 and 37, once he's down in the well, then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And we can read that easily as, oh, see, Judah, he's trying to keep him from killing him. He's trying to do a good thing. Don't give him that out. He was the one that threw him in the pit with everyone else. When he saw him there, he explicitly said, let's not kill him, only because he saw slave traders, because he said, what profit is it if we kill him? He didn't say, what good is it? This is wrong, we shouldn't do this. He says, no, let's just sell him into slavery and pretend to kill him, and that way we can earn a little coin off of it. That way we can get a little silver from our betrayal of our own kin. It was Judah's idea to give him not death, but a life of death in slavery. That's where he was before this story. Selfishness, greed, covetousness, anger, and hatred had consumed his heart and defined him. That was his identity. That's what the line of the tribe of Judah was. But then let's fast forward. Let's move ahead. Let's move ahead past chapter 38, chapter 39, where we get the unkind metaphor to Potiphar's wife, where we get another accusation, another thing dealing with lust, and other sins, wherein Tamar is falsely accused in the same way that Joseph will be falsely accused. But let's jump forward even further than that to Genesis 43. Genesis 43, where after they had gone and they'd seen their brother and they didn't recognize him. And so because Joseph really wanted to get back at them, Joseph laid his hand of revenge. Joseph said, you are spies, and I'm going to steal Simeon, and I'm going to make him a prisoner. I'm going to let him know what the inside of a jail cell feels like in Egypt, and you guys can go back. And if you want him back, you'll have to bring your youngest brother with you. And they go, and for years they dwell in their father's land because their father will not risk Benjamin. Their father will not risk his youngest son. Their father will not, for the sake of righteousness, for the sake of redeeming Simeon, will not gamble the life of his precious beloved son. So Judah in Genesis 43, he makes a pledge and says that I will be responsible for him. I will make sure he comes back. It is on me. I will take the responsibility of my youngest brother, the brother whom my father clearly loves the most. And he transforms from that selfish, hateful man in the way he treated Joseph to now bearing the responsibility for Benjamin. And when they return, and in chapter 44, Joseph sees his brother and he gives them a great feast, but he still is laying vengeance upon them. He's still testing them. He puts his silver cup and he puts it into Benjamin's satchel, so when they're leaving, he accuses them of theft, and he says, whoever stole it will go into prison, and the rest of you can go free. And he pulls it out of Benjamin's satchel, the one whom their father loves most. He will go in prison. He will be a slave in Egypt. And you guys can get away scot-free. It wasn't you. It was just him. And you can get out of here. You can save your own skin. You can live your own lives. You can even take back all the food that you wanted. And you can live wonderfully just like Judah did in chapter 38 when he left from the selling of his brother. You can live your best life. And you won't have to worry about anything anymore. All it'll cost you is another brother. And see what happens. See what God has done with Judah's heart. Genesis 44, verses 30 through 34. Now therefore, as soon as I come to your servant my father, and the boy is not with us, then as his life is bound up in the boy's life, as soon as he sees that the boy is not with us, he will die. And your servants will bring down the gray hairs of your servant our father with sorrow to Sheol. For your servant became a pledge of safety for the boy to my father, saying, if I do not bring him back to you, then I shall bear the blame before my father all my life. Now therefore, please let your servant remain instead of the boy as a servant to my Lord. And let the boy go back with his brothers. For how can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? I fear to see the evil that would find my father. Judah very casually profited on the sorrow of Joseph. But on the other side of Tamar, on the other side of seeing righteousness displayed, juxtaposed against his own hypocrisy, his own evil, and his own selfishness, and his own fear, and his own broken promises, Judah stands up before the most powerful man in Egypt, save Pharaoh. And he says, I'm going to keep my promise that I made to my father. And I am going to sacrifice myself and take the punishment that you want to give him so that he can go free. Judah is innocent in this. He didn't steal the cup. As far as he knows, maybe Benjamin did or did not take it. The evidence is there. But regardless, he is willing to take the punishment of his brother and trade himself go free. Judah has finally embraced what it means to be the Lion of the tribe of Judah. And of all the people to be a sign of Christ to come, this wicked old lech gets it right. And will sacrifice himself, take an unearned punishment to save his brother and redeem him, and let him go free. God, it doesn't say explicitly in the Bible that God works in mysterious ways, but God certainly throws a curveball at us. And what we expect to see, we don't find. And who he chooses to use and call to do great things, we never would have been. He chooses this outcast daughter-in-law who seems to have a curse hanging around her neck, to instead have this signet and cord hanging around her neck as she saves the family of Judah. And transforms Judah's heart so that when he is in position, he saves his brother Benjamin. And that act right there causes Joseph to break into tears, to reveal his alter ego. Clark Kent jumps into the phone booth and reveals who he's been all along. And the family is restored. This broken, messed up family of hurt, pain, and vengeance. And it all gets buried. And the brothers hug. And the family is redeemed. The family is saved from the famine. And they have the choicest lands in Goshen. Because Judah stood up and had the courage to do the right thing. To stop being selfish. And to keep his promise. Even when that promise comes at a high cost. The story also has some other parallels that are important. See, Judah went to what he thought was an unreputable woman. And he went to her and I believe it was a name. A name which, by the way, means fountain. And there by the waters, their relationship took a turn. Many, many centuries later, Jesus Christ would go to a woman that actually was unrighteous by a well. Jacob's well, in fact. A well that she said was made by Jacob, and whom all Jacob and his sons, including Judah, drank water from. And there that Samaritan woman, whom Jesus identified as having 5 husbands, and all of them, by his estimation, unrighteous. And compare that to Tamar, who, when you think about it, she had 3 husbands. Should have had a 4th that was denied her. And so now we're magnifying it. Go from 4, and it was all on the up and up, to 5, and they were all unrighteous. And God goes to this woman and gives her the offer of redemption. See, God claims her so that we would know if we are forgotten and lost in society, if we are outcast and we have been thrown to the side, that God sees us and God comes to us. And God went to her so that we know that if we were the Judah in the scenario, if we were the user or the abuser, if we were the oath breaker, if we were the one, the son of promise that threw it all away, it's not too late for us to come back to. Because God's great and glorious plan is the redemption of his people. And his people can include you if you heed the call of Christ. And hearing your sin, instead of rejecting him, proclaim, surely this is the Messiah. Surely this is the righteous one. And let everyone know the way to Jesus. Because your story becomes his story. The story of the family of Judah is one of redemption. Not of perfection. Not of always being great, so if you stumbled, you're out. Our identity wrapped up in our redemption, who we are in Christ. You see, Judah only was able to become the lion once again when he admitted what he had done and proclaimed the righteousness of Tamar and received back who he was supposed to be. Beloved, I don't know what sin grips you. I don't know if lust is knocking at your door, beating you down. I don't know if it's selfishness or covetousness. I don't know if it's murder or hate in your heart, and Jesus says those are the same things. What I do know is that Jesus Christ has an answer for all of them. And Jesus Christ patiently, lovingly calls for sinners to leave behind who they weren't supposed to be, so that God can make you who you were always meant to be all along. Beloved, the world has beaten us down and has tricked us and it has deluded us so that we think that up is down and down is up. And we think that we are our sin. God calls us to be lions. So do you want to follow along in the dark and the mire? Or do you want to rule? Do you want to have the courage of Tamar to call someone out of the darkness? And do you want to have the courage of Judah to admit when you're wrong? Because real maturity happens when we stop blaming others and everything and circumstances for everything that's wrong with our life and start taking responsibility. That we are where we are because of the choices we've made. Only then can you make the choice to follow Jesus Christ. And that's the most important choice you'll ever make. Dear God, we ask that you soften our hearts, Lord. First, soften it for the lost. Soften it, Lord, for those that don't know you, that are as turned around and mixed up as we once were, as we occasionally still are. We ask, God, that you soften our hearts also for those that you have a special care for, the widow, the orphan, the alien in the midst, those that are overlooked in society, those that no one cares about, knowing that people don't even ask to know their name because they don't want to. Let us see our nose hanging in the midst of our presence and see those that we have deliberately overlooked so that we can care for them, so that we can be what we're supposed to be, Lord, so we can be the church. And God, we ask, most importantly, most powerfully, most painfully, we ask, God, for the self-awareness to see the darkness that we carry in our hearts, the darkness that we should have excised when we asked you to live in it, the darkness that we have picked back up and carried with us still. We ask, God, that you point out our hypocrisy, point out our injustice, point out our irony, that we can see it for what it is and reject it, God, and stop rejecting you. Because, Lord, you're coming back. You are coming back, Lord, and what a shame it will be if we don't recognize you. What a shame it would be if we get deceived by the Hollywood Jesus, if we get tricked by the hippie Jesus, if we get tricked by the Jesus we want you to be, instead of embracing the Jesus that you are, so that we can see you and know you, Lord. So we ask, God, that we walk and we live with you now. We ask, God, that you drive out the darkness that would deceive us now. We ask, God, that we cling to the redemptive power of the gospel. Live that new life in it now. Because, God, you keep your promise to us. May we always and ever be given the strength from you to keep our promise to you. In the name of Jesus Christ.